why don't we get started? People can still, I will leave the poll up for the next few minutes, but feel free to obviously continue to use the chat. But definitely want to get started as people continue to dial in. Super excited to share our topic today, featuring our lovely friend Santosh from Atlassian to talk about their upgrading versus migrating story and how they scaled their developers' efficiency within 1 week. A little bit about the agenda, as well as some housekeeping. We'll obviously go through some introductions on who you'll be hearing from. Santosh will share his story on how they kind of chose between upgrading versus migrating with Sentry, what that process actually looked like, some of the lessons learned, and then we'll definitely have some time for open discussion and Q&A at the end. On that note, a few housekeeping notes. This is recorded, so definitely feel free to take whatever notes you'd like throughout this call, but we will share the recording afterwards, so you can use it after, share it with your teammates or your friends that maybe couldn't make it, but we will definitely be able to distribute this out to everyone and those that couldn't make it today. And then this is a very interactive session for sure. We want to make this engaging and for you, so everyone does have the ability to actually come off mute and ask questions, raise your hand, chat with us, share your comments and your stories. We want to make sure we're hearing from you and keeping you engaged as well. So you'll be able to do that throughout the call. And if so, there's always the chat and the Q&A as backup if you'd like to use that as well. But definitely come off mute and talk with us. We want to hear you. And there, last but not least, there is a short poll survey at the end of this call, just to get a little bit of feedback on how this went for everyone. We always want to take in your insight and your feedback into improving these workshops for future. So if you have a few seconds at the end, definitely feel free to answer those questions. That would be super helpful for our team. All right, without further ado, super excited to introduce Santosh, who is a Senior Systems Engineer at Atlassian, who will be joined by Richard, our Solutions Engineering Manager from the Sentry side, to share their migration story. I will hand it over to you, Santosh.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Hey everyone, welcome and thanks for joining, and love the answers for should pineapple belong in a pizza. I think we're all aligned there. So welcome once again. My name is Santosh. I'm a Senior Systems Engineer in the Observability team at Atlassian here in Sydney, Australia. I've been with Atlassian for almost 2 years now, and I focus on designing and building tools and services that make up our observability platform. I have a background in network and security engineering. I've also dabbled in application development and in a previous life as an SRE as well. Today, I'll be taking you through how Sentry fits into Atlassian's observability platform and the impact of a decision that we made late last year, which was to migrate from Sentry OSS that we were running on-prem ourselves to Sentry SaaS. Why we did it, how we did it, what are some of the things that we learned along the way, what you should watch out for, etc. So I'll walk you through the entire journey from migration to implementation and finally where we are today and how Sentry has helped us. And before I do that, I'd like to introduce you to Atlassian and also observability at Atlassian. If you haven't heard of us, Atlassian is based out of Sydney and in the US and a few other places around the globe. We create products to unleash every team's potential. Some of the products that we create are listed in this slide. We recently also released some in our Team 2022 event this time around, but you probably have heard. A very quick note about our scale. We have over 200,000 customers worldwide, spread across 190 different countries. We have over 10 million monthly active users using all or some of our products, and over 83% of Fortune 500 companies use, again, some or any or all of our products. So it's safe to say that we're truly globally distributed and we work at a fairly large scale, which brings with itself some challenges, some interesting challenges that we will also talk about today. And zooming in a little bit more, I'd like to now talk about a little bit about our tech stack, what that looks like, what the DevX is at Atlassian, and something about my team as well, and how Sentry fits into all of this. So Atlassian's applications and services are written in a number of languages, and our developers pick the right language for the job. So that means that our stack is also quite varied. Some of the top languages in use at Atlassian today are JavaScript, Java, Python, Golang, and Rust. And all applications and services at Atlassian run on an internal platform as a service that we created called Micros. This is merely an abstraction layer on top of AWS, and our developers interact with Micros APIs as opposed to AWS APIs. So for example, say you wanted to create an EC2 instance, you would declaratively ask Micros to create one for you. And the resource that is created is Atlassian compliant. So it has auto telemetry, and it gets automatic security updates, and we handle deployments and rollouts, etc. So it makes it easier for developers to do the right thing. And then currently we have over 200 teams across Atlassian who send telemetry from over 280 applications to Sentry. And what our developers use Sentry for primarily is to collect, correlate, and diagnose errors mostly from front end, but also a significant portion of our backend applications. And Sentry is especially useful to us to diagnose unhandled exceptions and stack traces. The ability to correlate them and surface them easily is sort of why we use Sentry primarily today. Since our tech stack is quite varied, we obviously use the official Sentry SDKs to instrument our applications, and our developers just pick the right SDK for their job. So what role does the observability team play at Atlassian? So the observability team, which I'm part of, designs and maintains the instrumentation libraries, sidecars, and agents that we use to collect telemetry from our applications, services, platforms, whatever runs on Micros, and outside of Micros as well. This could be things like traces, metrics, logs, profiling data, and crash dumps. So we also own the pipelines that not only collects this telemetry data, but also enriches them, transforms them, and ships them to various relevant storage backends. And this could be Atlassian built ones or vendor-specific observability platforms like Sentry. And we do this reliably and at scale. So that's basically a quick intro to what observability does at Atlassian and how Sentry fits into our entire tech stack. So moving on. Now, getting into the crux of what I'd really like to talk to you all about today. And before I do that, I'd like to set some context around why we wanted to migrate, specifically some of the challenges that we faced running Sentry OSS on-prem ourselves. So we ran version 9 of Sentry, so it's fairly antiquated now, so we couldn't offer some of the more recently introduced features that our users really wanted. This was one of the biggest challenges we faced as a team because this meant that we either had to implement all of these features ourselves at a platform level, therefore providing that same functionality to everyone, or say no to our users, which is obviously something you never want to do. As you know, at that point, you're not only impacting their efficiency as a developer, but you're also impacting their ability to instrument and observe these applications. And in our case, it was impacting their ability to instrument and observe according to a standard that we ourselves had set for them as an observability team. So one choice we had, of course, was to upgrade, right? So upgrading from version 9, the next major release was 10, and upgrading to version 10 meant a fairly significant architectural change. And we had certain restrictions imposed on us by our internal paths that meant that we couldn't support some of the critical services that are required for version 10. This is mostly around running stateful resources like Kafka and ClickHouse. So this was basically a no-go for us, at least in the medium term. So that wasn't a choice for us at all. Regardless of which version we ran, I think we were always going to have to deal with vulnerabilities in packages that are used by Sentry relays, and even at the operating system level. At Atlassian, vulnerable packages are identified by an internal vuln identification service, which identifies packages in software, and then it finds a relevant team, the service owners basically, and it creates tickets that are automatically assigned to these teams with very strict SLOs. And we then respond to that and triage it and close those vulns before breaching the SLOs. So this meant taking time out of our feature development work and upgrading, testing, and rolling out changes to resolve these vulns. And every change introduced the chance of regressions, as they always do. And what we found was vulns were identified at a high enough rate that we were spending a fairly significant amount of engineering time resolving them, right? And this is time we obviously could have spent building tools, features, and newer software for our users. Finally, to scale our Sentry platform to cater for the significant growth in customer numbers and user numbers we've seen over the last couple of years, meant that we had to make several changes to how we deployed and ran the various services that constitute a Sentry deployment. This meant that oftentimes we had to over-provision infrastructure just to cater for the spiky traffic patterns that we saw. And this was obviously very inefficient, not only from a cost perspective, but it also made the entire deployment a bit more complex to operate, and we just had to invest more engineering effort into maintaining and operating that. So in addition to Sentry, we also ran a much older version of Sentry relays as well, back when they were called Semaphore. And this was for compatibility reasons mainly. So we basically had the same set of challenges with relays as we did with Sentry itself. So all things considered, migrating to Sentry SaaS was a fairly obvious choice for us. But the question is, did we just jump in head first into it? No, I think we are a team of engineers, and there is always some healthy skepticism. And there were a few concerns that we had, namely, could Sentry handle our scale? Right? Some of our larger projects send millions of events immediately after a release if something goes wrong, or even if it doesn't when we do canary deployments. So we needed to make sure that the Sentry SaaS platform was elastic enough to support our spiky traffic patterns immediately after a release. Secondly, could we continue to meet our service level objectives? So we have strict SLOs to measure indicators like successful event ingestion, processing latency, and availability of Sentry in general. Our users, our developers able to log in and view their errors correctly? Does Sentry provide all the functionality it says it will? So all of these things we measure, and we look at historical performance, and we improve upon those. So we needed to make sure that Sentry SaaS could continue to or exceed these SLOs that we had. Finally, we also needed to make sure that there was a migration path that would result in minimal disruption to our users, right? So our SRE teams are globally distributed, they follow the sun, and we couldn't have Sentry being unavailable for any length of time. So this was also a very critical thing. So these three things were top of mind for us. And before I go into how we satisfied ourselves with this, I'm just going to pause here and ask you folks if there are any questions that you wanted to raise.
I'll ask a question. Sure. I'm just curious about the general population out there listening. And if you've thought about migrating from your self-hosted version of Sentry to the Sentry Cloud, what are your biggest concerns in doing that? And yeah, feel free to dump it in the chat or just speak up. I see one interesting question. What platform was used to maintain your on-premise OSS Sentry? Like, did you have Kubernetes, VMs?
Yeah, so we had EC2, but again, like I said, it's an abstraction layer. So EC2 under the hood, but we interacted with only the Docker daemon. So we provide artifacts like Docker images, container images, and our PaaS just schedules it and runs it. But under the hood, I believe at the time, we were on EC2. Yes, we're slowly moving to Kube, but at that point, EC2, yeah. So VMs.
Yeah. And this is really good information, Santosh, and something that we've seen in a number of migrations that we've done for our customers. We see more and more customers coming to us now, especially with the effort to upgrade being high. You're not the only one that has seen that. And these are the same things that they think about as well. So it's very interesting to hear your story.
Yeah, it's interesting that we never speak about these challenges, but I think we all face the same problems every day. And it's it's interesting to talk about it because then you learn that everyone else is having the same problem as well. Yeah. Cool. So moving on to yeah, perfect. So with that context set, you now know why we decided to migrate. And before we get into the details on the how, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we plan for the migration, right? And more specifically, our 3 non-negotiable conditions that essentially dictated our migration strategy. So the 3 non-negotiable conditions that we set for ourselves were no degradation to our reliability SLOs post-migration, no data loss, and finally, no disruption to our users. So to satisfy ourselves that Sentry could meet our service level objectives that I just spoke about, we met with our Bitbucket team. So they joined us through an acquisition, and they'd been using Sentry Cloud for a number of years then. So after speaking with them a couple of times and looking at their SLO stats over the last couple of years, we were satisfied with the performance and reliability of Sentry SaaS. So they had performed performance testing, then load testing, and we took that into consideration. We looked at their SLO stats, and we were satisfied that whatever we threw at Sentry, it could handle our scale. It's really then conditions 2 and 3, which is we wanted no data loss and we wanted 0 disruption to our users. And our users are obviously Atlassian developers and our SREs. So these conditions really dictated our migration strategy. So we decided that we were going to mirror traffic or events sent to our on-prem Sentry to Sentry Cloud. So this meant that our users could explore newer features on Sentry Cloud and improve upon their project configuration and implement some of those newer things that they wanted to do with actual data. And with actual data being sent, Sentry was also building up a catalog of events, right, which is very helpful in grouping and performance monitoring, historical performance monitoring, among other things. So this was obviously something that we wanted to do. What we also knew was we were going to run a new Sentry relay service in parallel. And this relay would exclusively send events to Sentry SaaS. This is so that our users could plan their migration and make their switch over at a time that is best suited to them, whilst continuing to have an operational Sentry deployment sending them alerts. So this was part of the no disruption to our user strategy, right? So we wanted no data loss, so they could switch over when they wanted to, whenever they had time or whenever they knew that their traffic patterns were nominal. And they, at the same time, they also had a fully functioning Sentry deployment doing whatever it did for them. So this was sort of these 2 conditions. This is how it sort of fed into our migration strategy. So moving on to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. So this is the meat of the whole talk, and probably more interesting than others. So let's get into a bit more detail about our migration itself. So this diagram on this slide shows you a picture of our on-prem setup and the components that we added during our migration, right? So the components in gray that you see were all part of our legacy setup, and the components that I've marked in green were all the ones we added. The green Nginx bit, I couldn't change the logo, so just the ones shaded in green were the ones that we added. So the most interesting component in this whole thing, at least for me personally, was the Go Replay service, which we added to Sentry. And the way that diagram is structured may be confusing. Think of it as a service that we added alongside other services in a Docker Compose file, right? So it's basically on the same network segment, and they can talk to each other. So Nginx and Go Replay and Sentry, they're all similar network segment or the same network segment. So Go Replay, what is it? So it's essentially a traffic capture tool, but what it offers is the ability to decapsulate packets that you send to it. And it's able to modify the payload within that and forward it onto an endpoint you configure. Right, so it's quite powerful from what it can do, and it does it at scale. Right, there's hardly any latency for it to do this. Well, negligible latency. So that's the bit we added. And in our case, we set up the Go Replay service with a middleware binary that the Sentry team built for us. So the middleware is basically something, it's a process that the main Go Replay process will spawn. So basically when it receives a packet, it sends it off to the middleware, which does its thing, which manipulates the packet, changes it if it needs to, or and then sends it back to Go Replay, which will then forward it on to a third-party destination you've configured. So that's basically how the mirroring works. So in our case, the middleware binary was able to remap the DSN in the event envelope. So if you provide it with a mapping file that maps an on-prem project DSN to a cloud project DSN, it rewrites the payload and it with the cloud DSN and sends it back to the Go Replay service, which will send it to Sentry SaaS. So that's basically how that traffic mirroring works. The other bits in green, the load balancer and the relays. Well, those are the new set of relays that we set up that we're only forwarding events to Sentry SaaS. It's the second path that I spoke about. I realize this diagram has some Atlassian specific components, but let me just very quickly go over what that entire path looks like. So the global edge proxy is exactly what you think it is. It's a globally distributed reverse proxy that we deploy across all regions, and its primary function is to route traffic to according to a routing table that we give it, right? So when traffic reaches it, it looks up the destination and it finds a rule. It's weighted, it's resilient, it does some authentication, rate limiting, etc., and forwards it on to the right destination. That's its primary job, nothing more, nothing less. The Micros platform we spoke about. So it's the internal PaaS service. It's an abstraction layer we build on top of AWS, which then provides the same components that AWS would. Load balancers are basically in a layer 3 application load balancer, but I've just chosen to use generic names here. So load balancer, so the path that a packet will take, for example, an event would be, say, an event is generated from a web client. It first reaches a global edge proxy, which then routes it to a layer 3 load balancer, which runs Sentry relays. So the Sentry relays will obviously validate that the event is valid, apply any rate limiting rules, etc. And then they send it on to an Nginx cluster. And Nginx merely just sends it off to a Sentry backend, right? So an event processor, which then sends it off to an event storage. And then there's a web server there as well. So it's a standard Sentry deployment. The things that we added there is the Go Replay service, like I said. So what we did was to modify our Nginx configuration in a way that whenever a packet was received or event was received destined to the /store endpoint, it would also mirror the same event to Go Replay, which would then receive it and send it off to the middleware, which would unpack it, remap the DSN, send it back to Go Replay, and would forward it on to Sentry SaaS. Fairly simple from what it actually does. So how did we go about the actual migration now that you know what the setup looked like and what the interim architecture looked like? So the first step, obviously, for us was to determine the number of active and inactive projects that we had. So any project that hadn't received an event for at least 2 weeks, we classified as inactive or stale. So this just helped us in determining which projects we needed to migrate. So we give our users access to create projects whenever they need. So some of them do create projects and never use them. So we just needed to identify which ones were worth migrating and which ones weren't. So once we did that, we exported our on-prem configuration using the Sentry service CLI. And what this does is a single line command which generates a JSON blob which contains all of your project configuration. And we sent this off to the Sentry team, and they helped us import that into an org that we'd set up previously on SaaS. The export file contains things like your teams, your projects, your project-specific configuration like alerts, integrations, etc. It, however, doesn't contain some key things that we will talk about in a little bit. Once that was done, so like I said, we modified our Nginx configuration next to add an additional mirror destination. And you can do this with any fairly recent version of Nginx using the HTTP mirror module. And that sent all traffic destined to the store endpoint. And like we like I just spoke about, in order for the middleware binary to rewrite the DSNs, you will need to provide it with a mapping file. This is a simple text file that just has, on every line, you'd have the on-prem DSN with the cloud DSN. And that's how it would just look when an event is received, it would look up the DSN. And if it finds a valid map, it would just remap it and send it across. However, if it doesn't find a valid mapping, it just discards that packet. That event. So once that was done, once the Nginx configuration was changed and we were able to mirror traffic, we then set up a parallel Sentry relay deployment. And obviously, we used the official Docker images, which makes it compatible for us to run it on our PaaS. And obviously, we used a much recent version of Relay as well. So that was all set up with an upstream configure to Sentry SaaS. And folks could just change merely to migrate. All our developers had to do was to just change the DSNs on their SDKs on their clients, the client side. And that would just mean that they can start using new relays and just send traffic to Sentry SaaS as opposed to the legacy on-prem Sentry. So that was basically it. This was all designed, tested, and deployed in probably under a week. We managed to mirror traffic from 2 of our top projects to Sentry Cloud within the first week. We just wanted to test the system at load. And I guess there were 2 main reasons as to how we were able to accomplish this quickly. Firstly, our internal PaaS environment, Micros, it offers developers and us an excellent dev experience that makes it very easy to deploy, scale, secure, and run containerized services, right, without significant effort. There's not a lot of boilerplate code that you need to write, infrastructure as code. It's a declarative YAML syntax that you submit, and then it parses it, validates it, and deploys what you ask of it. So it's very smooth experience. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is the Sentry team that we worked with. Shout out to Neil, Katie, and Don. They were excellent, and they were very prompt in providing us with any help we needed, and very prompt in answering any technical questions we had. So this meant that we were hardly ever blocked in anything, right? Or we were hardly left wanting for any information when the docs eventually fell short of for something like traffic mirroring, for example. So once this was all set up, all we did was announce the migration and help our users with any query they had. So it was mostly waiting for everyone to switch over. So the actual work that we did was well under a week, and it was just waiting. So that's basically how we actuated the whole migration process. Again,
that's great. That's great, Santosh. I think you mentioned earlier that you had 280 applications that you were migrating. Is that about the same number of projects you had in Sentry, or how many projects do you think you migrated?
I think close to that, yes.
Right, yeah. And that was a lot of projects that were moving with a lot of settings and so on. And so this was the strategy that we came up with to assist you in the migration. And you're able to do it in a week, which is really impressive. One thing that I want to point out as a Sentry representative is that we have a number of migration strategies available to use depending on your scale and the use that you have. So while this was what worked for Atlassian, this may not necessarily be the right way or the easiest way for you. Anybody else considering migration. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. So I think at this point,
on to the next one, right? Yeah. So yeah, speaking of which, we would love to hear, we have this poll here, and we'd love to hear how many projects you have on Sentry, and just to get an idea of what migrations would look like for those of you who've done it. We've done at least a dozen migrations from on-prem to SaaS within this year, and so we have this process and plan pretty much dialed in based on what your situation is. And that's one reason why it's important to work with us on doing those migrations.
Awesome. Seeing a lot of smaller kind of 1 to 20, and then a couple folks on 100 plus as well. So we just wanted to get a quick poll, but I'll share the results here so people can actually see it, which is really exciting to kind of see the spread for sure. All right, I will continue back to slides.
Awesome. That was quite interesting results. You see
see the spread. Yeah, it's either one or the other.
Cool. So moving on from how we did the migration, the technical details, to some of the things that we think you should watch out for if you're considering a migration from on-prem to Sentry Cloud. Again, this was from our experience. Your mileage may vary, but these are good things to keep in mind nonetheless. So the export-import process is currently designed to be once-off, right? So this means that if you run on-prem and cloud in parallel like we did, you will need to keep your config in sync, right? So once you do the export-import, if there are folks who go in and add more projects, change your settings, obviously you can't do an incremental update. So you will need to automate this, which is exactly what we did in our case. Secondly, the export-import process is not perfect either. There will be some things that are missing, right? So, for example, mapping of teams to projects is not something that the import process will preserve. Another example is rate limiting settings on your client keys. If you have a certain rate events per minute set on your DSNs, that's not preserved either. So we ended up automating this in our case. So if you're in an older version of Sentry, like we were, there are likely going to be some significant enough changes that the import process is not going to be able to handle very well. An example of that would be, in our case, that we saw that the project alert configuration UI had changed significantly, right? So whatever import we did was not perfect, and that left our alerts sort of half configured, if you will. Because we had also used older plugins and older integrations as well. So the Sentry team in the end helped us in modifying the configuration we'd ported en masse in the backend. So I'd say this is a very good idea nonetheless, like just what Richard mentioned. For any significantly or sufficiently complex migration, reach out to the Sentry team early on in your process so they're able to guide you through some of the gotchas, some of the things that could trip you up. And the last two things are obvious, but they're also very obviously missed, right? So if you use webhooks to send events or alerts from your project to an internal service, you will need to make sure that these webhooks are accessible from the internet. Otherwise, Sentry SaaS is not going to be able to access them, and you will end up having a bad time. If you rely on automatic source map fetching, and like some of our projects did especially for your JavaScript source files, and these are all hosted in a private repository, these will obviously not work when you move to Sentry SaaS. This will impact Sentry's ability to not only group, but also search. So users will go in, they will try to find a particular event, they will not be able to find it. And that's because Sentry is not able to parse that unminify or parse the entire event payload. So you should be uploading artifacts to Sentry in this case when you create releases. And there are a number of ways to do this. And the Sentry website has documentation on the recommended approach and also tools on how to do this. And it's fairly easy to do, which is what we asked our developers to do before we moved. So these are basically some of the things that we think that you should know. The process itself is not very complicated, but these are some of the small ones that could really trip you up.
Yeah, those are great points to bring up, Santosh, and I appreciate that. And we really learned a lot doing the migration as well, and have built some additional scripts and tools to address mapping of teams to projects, for example, or the rate limits. And we're continuing to invest to make this process easier for other people going forward. Thanks for being the guinea pig, Santosh. But yeah, yeah, it'll be easier for everyone else.
Yeah, someone had to do it. Yes.
Yep.
Awesome. Moving on from that, here are some of the things that we learned along the way, which we now, looking back, which I hope that we've done better. Firstly, in hindsight, we shouldn't have picked December to announce the migration and set up mirroring like we did. So our rationale within observability was that December is typically a period where there's not a lot of changes being implemented across our platforms and services. And so our developers might have time to verify and implement the changes that we required of them, namely just log into Sentry SaaS, check that all of their mapping was correct, all of the alert configuration was all valid, all the event allocation rules were all there, and they could also then spend time to change the DSNs over in their SDKs and do the deployments. So there were some things that we still wanted them to do, and we hoped that December would be a good time for them to do it because they didn't have a lot of feature work. But it turned out that they'd scheduled in a lot of non-feature work for December specifically for that reason. And they didn't, at the end of the day, they didn't have enough time or bandwidth to do this, right? So we had to move our deadline basically by a couple of weeks. I know it's always hard to pick an appropriate window for migration, especially anything that is of a significant enough scale, and especially when you need to collaborate with a large number of teams. So I would say expect to give yourself additional time and engage teams early on in the process so that they know it's coming, right? So we waited until we had a solid plan locked in before announcing it. In hindsight, maybe we should have said, look, we intend to migrate so that everyone's mentally prepared and they're allocating some time in their sprints and then announce it later on. The second thing, and we knew this going in, but it was sort of reinforced for us along the way, is work with the Sentry team early on, right? As early as possible. All the configuration and setup that we had to do after we imported our configuration, all the changes that we needed to make in the backend because of the UI changes, the ones that have been resolved now. But for us, all of those changes would have taken us significantly higher time to get right if it weren't for the help we received from Sentry. So always a good idea, and do it early on. So those are the things I think you should really keep an eye out for. So where are we today? Where are we with Sentry at Atlassian today? We have fully decommissioned our on-prem Sentry platform. So we did have a deadline that we announced to our users. Like I said, we had to extend it, but we had one final deadline. And on the day, we sent out one final comp that we were going to do this, and we undeployed our Sentry Relay and Sentry Web Service from our prod environment. We did leave the more stateful components around, like the database, so we could restore, bring the service back up if anything should go catastrophically wrong, which it didn't. We also know that we're now able to instrument and observe our relays better. This is thanks to the logging in metrics we get out of the box with the more recent versions of Sentry Relay. We had to do that ourselves with Semaphore, but now we just get that out of the box, which is great. We also use the official Docker images, so deploying and running relays are trivial on our paths, and keeping them updated just means, well, upgrading the version really. We've significantly also reduced our complexity, as obviously we don't maintain a stateful service that we need to patch, upgrade, or scale. So that's great. Sentry does that hard work for us. So we've reduced our complexity and also the effort we spend on maintaining it. And Sentry has held up to our scale quite easily, right? So even when we rerouted some of the more from some of our busiest services like Jira Frontend, during the initial stages of our migration, we hardly had any issues with saturation or performance. And Sentry has continued to hold up to all of our SLOs, and it's matched them. So how would I summarize our experience? I'd say that we were able to set up the SaaS org with all the relevant configuration, set up the migration path and mirror traffic in about 5 days. Overall, we completed this migration from start to finish in a little over a month. This is including the extension and the time we allowed for our users to move over. We've since reclaimed, obviously, the equivalent of almost two engineers working full-time on Sentry. And this is time that we've now reallocated to building more products and features for our users. So overall, we're quite pleased with how smooth this whole process was, evidently, because I'm here talking to you all about how well it went.
Yeah, Santosh, I'm really curious. You mentioned that you had your existing infrastructure going alongside the Sentry Cloud, and you're sending events to both of those through Go Replay. once you completed the migration, like how long did it take until that last error went to your on-prem, instance, and you were finally able to just turn it off? And how did you know that, oh, it's time to turn it off?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And this is something that I should have probably gone into a bit more detail. So that was something that we learned along the way as well, in that, so we'd given folks a deadline, right? So we had a 30-day window for which they could migrate. We extended that. So at the end of the day, it was 45 days. And we knew it was a hard deadline. Folks had to move over. But we had to remind a few folks who were evidently busy and who couldn't do it. And the way we found which projects had actually moved over, or rather who was actually using the old path, was actually ironically made easier because we had the two parallel paths. So what we did was to modify the middleware or the Go replay code a little bit to log the DSNs that the middleware saw. So with that being logged, we were then able to map the DSNs to which projects and therefore to which teams. But we now had a list of teams that were still using the old relays. We had a dashboard up, but we also had, and then when we got closer to the deadline, we still had about 10 teams who had to move over. And it was just a matter of doing the legwork, right? Just what we did in our case was create a Confluence page and found the team owners. We tagged them all and said, hey, look, we're going to be turning this off in 15 days. You have to move now. And it was just that final push they needed to move over. And it was basically, it wasn't, the migration cost was low because all the hard work had been done for them. I think that made that whole process easier. But yes, that's basically how we did find out. We did try to ask the Sentry team if there was a way to find out within Sentry itself, depending on was there anything in the event payload that could tell us which relay the events were using? But that's a feature that I think we put in a request for that. That's coming soon, I believe. But for now, that's what we had to do. And when we saw that there was no more events going because we've instrumented our on-prem relays, we could tell that the traffic volume had dropped significantly, and we knew that everyone else was using the new relays. And that was basically our cue to turn it off.
Yeah, that's great information. Thank you.
Cool. I don't see any questions. So what's next for us? So the next steps that we plan is to get our users to adopt Sentry in their workflows more for release management and performance monitoring. We also want to integrate Sentry into our incident management workflows a little bit better. So we have a fairly straightforward incident management workflow that and all of our observability products sort of fit into this. And we want Sentry to play a bigger role in this as well. So those are the next steps we have planned in the short term. And finally, thanks so much for listening. And if what I spoke about today sounded interesting and exciting to you, and you want to work on challenges such as this, then come join us. Atlassian is constantly growing and hiring talented folks across the world. And thanks to our Team Anywhere policy, you can work from anywhere that makes sense to you, as long as Atlassian has a presence there. And this list of places where you can work from grows every other week. And now we have folks working from more countries than ever across the globe. We currently have, I believe, over 160 roles open globally, and you can learn more about the teams, the roles, what they do on our careers page listed on this slide, or you can just reach out to me on LinkedIn. And once again, thank you so much for listening, and hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Santosh. Does anyone have any questions for the team before we give you all back some time at the end? I know, folks calling in from all around the world, so we want to make sure we're mindful of your time. And but also, obviously, if anyone does have questions, like I said at the beginning, you can go off mute. You can also use the chat or the Q&A. But we want to make sure you feel good leaving this and answer any questions you might have. So I will pause here if anyone does want to chat or go off mute. All right. If not, Thank you so much, Matthias, for the note. Thank you, Santosh and Richard, for your time. I think this was super helpful just to hear about the migration process and the things that you learned along the way. Hopefully we were helpful and continue to be. And again, everyone who joined, thank you so much. Don't forget to fill out that survey if you have a couple seconds at the end, and we will send out the recording in a little bit. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Appreciate your time.